I'm so happy to be back. I was here. I was here last year, and what a difference a year makes. A lot of you were here before. We have some new faces, and as Kristen said, it's really exciting, the progress that's happened over the past year. It seems like everyone is really coming together around a shared purpose, and we do have a lot of momentum going. So I'm going to try to just capture some of that and talk about some trends that we're seeing both in the states and some federal developments that are driving those trends. So just really quick, for those of you who are not very familiar with Workforce Data Quality Campaign, we are a nonprofit group. We're not affiliated with the U.S. Department of Labor, although we view them as an important partner. So yes, we don't give out your grants. We just like to help, and we're excited to see them happen. So our mission is to advocate for inclusive, aligned, and market-relevant education and workforce data, and we advocate at both the federal and the state levels. And at the state level, we have our state blueprint, which has 13 key features of what we think a really strong state data system looks like. We developed that with input from many of you, from experts at the federal level, so we really feel like we've got a good plan going forward. And we put on your tables the Mastering the Blueprint report. So all of you have that, and it has the blueprint there for your reference, as well as the results of our survey, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. Thanks to all of you who helped fill out our state survey this year. We just asked you very simply, how do you rate yourself on each of these blueprint elements on a 3-point scale? Are you, just getting started? Are you making pretty good progress, or have you actually achieved these elements? And I'll talk about what we found. We do have several national partners that we work with, and the handout's on your table, so you have a list of those, and we are foundation funded. I won't go through all of our funders, but thanks. And so let's talk a little bit about state progress. So you have the detailed list of state results in your Mastering the Blueprint reports, but some of the highlights that we saw, there's a couple areas where there's really good progress, and I'm sure this is going to echo what you've been hearing over the past couple of days here. Interagency data governance, a lot of states, either through legislation or just through common practice, are putting together interagency councils. A bigger swath of folks are coming to the table. It's not all K-12 anymore. We've really brought some other folks into the mix. And in addition to that governance piece, there is state funding support. States are noticing the value of these data systems. They're starting to come through with funding both for the governance and for maintenance and development of the systems, which is a good thing, since the new SLDS grant notice that was posted at midnight last night specifically says, we are not paying for maintenance. You gotta do something with these. So it's great that, and as you all know, because you do this work, there is ongoing maintenance. To pretend that there isn't is ignoring a big piece of what this work looks like. So it's great that states are going to step up and maintain some of the sustainability of these systems. And finally, on the good progress line, assessing employment outcomes. This is an area where we've really seen a lot of progress and a lot of interest, especially across the post-secondary education system is driving a lot of this. I'm sure the conversations in your states are the same. There's a lot of concern about the rising cost of college, increasing college debt. So parents and students and policymakers and even college presidents are starting to ask, okay, what's this degree really getting folks in terms of results in the labor market? So that's driving a lot of interest in linking to wage records and getting post-secondary employment outcomes, and we're seeing that come through. So in our survey, we noted that 37 states say that they're either in progress or have achieved tracking the employment outcomes of an increasing number of education and workforce programs. So on the areas for improvement, so measuring non-degree credentials, this is another thing that's talked about very frequently. Degrees, we have a pretty good handle on. Colleges know how to record degrees that are awarded, but as we all know, there's a lot of middle skill jobs that are very important. Some of these non-degree credentials, either on the path to or in addition to degrees, are really important for helping people access opportunity in their careers. So figuring out how to track that data, because it's outside of the traditional education system, It's a challenge. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that was an area where a lot of states said, well, we're not quite sure how to do that, or we're making some progress, but we don't feel like we're there yet. Another one, industry validation. There's a lot of work going on in all of your states around industry partnerships and bringing industry to the table to talk about designing curricula, but there's not a lot of really systematic efforts to take a look across all of the credentials that are being awarded and have industry, give a stamp of approval. So we're kind of looking for more statewide, more systematic, more scalable efforts to make that happen. And skills gap analysis, this is something that's starting to take off. This is a really important use. Once you are able to track all of your credentials, it's of interest to many of your state leaders, whether those credentials that are being awarded by your colleges and universities and training providers are matching up with the jobs that are actually in demand. So those skills gap analyses are gaining traction, and it's again something that states said they wanted to do more with. I'm going to talk about just a couple of these in depth. So assessing employment outcomes. State efforts, what's driving the progress in this area? First of all, data sharing agreements. States are figuring out how to construct these data sharing agreements in a way that is beneficial to different, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to mention stakeholders. You've all on overload, but it's to construct these agreements so that the data can be beneficial for a variety of stakeholders. Wanted to give a shout out to some work that one of our partners is doing, the Council on Regional Economic Competitiveness. They're a DC-based group, and especially those of you who focus a lot on labor market information are very familiar with them. And they recently had a conference, some of you were there, that looked at data sharing agreements in states and what's really the process for building those agreements. And they are going to be coming out with a report on that probably in April, so keep an eye out for that. We'll certainly post it on our website. In addition, legislation on wage record access has been really important. There's a couple of states that are kind of pushing on what's possible. So couple of states that aren't in the room but are doing interesting things. So California and New York both passed legislation giving. In California, it allows access to wage records for the community college system, not the individual community colleges, but for the system. So their community college system has been able to do quite a bit of analysis, especially for their career and technical education programs. And they've launched an internal dashboard called Launchpad that keeps the individual data confidential. It protects privacy according to all of the confidentiality rules that we know are really important. So it does protect that individual confidentiality, but it allows the people who are doing the career and technical education systems to see some aggregate outcomes of their programs. So that's been important to them. And New York State has their Department of Labor. They've developed a process so that researchers can get access to unidentified individual data for some of this longitudinal research that Kristen was alluding to. So it's more than just kind of the snapshots and dashboards. So that's been interesting. And other states are kind of looking to some of these as models. Maine recently had a task force that talked about making data more available to their community college system and their universities in particular. Performance-based funding. This falls under the category of it's not an easy button for these systems. It's a complexity and nuance button, which people don't like pressing nearly as much. But this is one thing that, there's a lot of interest in driving performance in higher education through the use of data and through the use of performance-based funding. And there are ways that with your expertise and your understanding of the complexity of the data, you can help to inform these performance-based funding systems that are getting put in place. And some of them are starting to include employment outcomes. There's several several states that use those. Texas, Florida, Kansas have some piece of employment outcomes in their systems, in their performance-based funding systems. Missouri passed a law last year, and there's a couple of other states that are looking at it. I think North Carolina community colleges are doing kind of a scan right now to look at how that might be implemented. In addition, tools for students and families and workers, being able to create the data sharing agreements and get the employment outcomes is one piece. The tools is another really exciting piece. A lot of states are putting this out by not only by college, but by program, by major of study, so that people can really start making decisions about education and careers. And we've heard that there's been a lot of interesting outreach efforts in some states. Minnesota, for example, has been going around and speaking at conferences with high school counselors and really teaching them how to use their employment outcomes tool to start those conversations with students. They may be looking at brochures and thinking about picnics on the quad, but there's also this horrible crushing debt that they should be thinking about, and the employment outcomes dashboards are often starting those kinds of conversations. So that's been a really positive development. In terms of federal developments that are driving these trends, so WIOA, I'm glad people want to talk about WIOA. We're always happy to talk about that. So one thing is WIOA training provider eligibility. So WIOA has maintain some of the performance outcomes reporting requirements from the Workforce Innovation Act and added on top of them. Training providers are now on the hook to provide employment outcomes not just for students who are being funded by WIOA, but for all of their students, because it provides a more accurate, complete picture of how viable those programs really are, and helps the one-stops and helps people decide where to take their training vouchers. So it's increasingly difficult to get by on surveys when you're looking at all of your program participants, depending on the size of the program. This is really, we think, going to drive a lot more use of administrative data, and states are working to figure that out. Another piece in the federal picture is the need for employment measures in all programs. The vice president last year released a report on job-driven training. He talked specifically about how some of our programs don't even measure employment. One in particular, the SNAP Employment and Training Program, the employment training program for folks who are on food stamps to move them into sustainable jobs. That historically has not had federal reporting, and there's going to be some regulations coming out this year that requires enhanced federal reporting. So helping some of these other programs figure out how to track their effectiveness. College ratings, employment is a piece of the college ratings proposal. And HEA reauthorization, the Higher Education Act. There are some drafts floating around for reauthorization of that act. Senator Harkin, before he retired, released a draft late last year, and it does call for reporting of employment outcomes. And we have heard that Senator Wyden is going to be introducing his student right to know before you go bill again, and it's exactly what it says, and it does call for reporting of employment outcomes by the feds, by program of study and by college for different intervals. I think it's 2, 6, and 15 years. So they're looking at real career trajectories. Next one. And then I'm checking my time. And then cross-state data sharing. So state efforts, we all know that when you're looking just at your in-state UI data, you're missing some things. States are trying to figure out how to use the wage record interchange system 2, which is the voluntary system that allows a broader swath of programs to exchange UI wage record data for specific program reporting purposes. Some post-secondary institutions are trying to work with their state workforce agencies to use this data, especially for their technical colleges. Florida and Texas in particular have been using this. The match rates are not great. It kind of bumps up the people they can find by about 6% on average, but when you're getting performance funding, every little bit helps, right? So we're taking a look at that and trying to figure out whether match rates would go up if a couple of key states joined RIS2, or if states are responding, but states are trying to use that more. And there's also regional data sharing that's happening. The Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education, Michelle's looking at me because she knows I always get that acronym wrong, WICHE. They're exchanging data with 4 states, UI data and post-secondary data, and they've really built a data set, and they're using the National Student Clearinghouse to house some of this and put together a data set that can look at mobility across those 4 states. Of course, many of you in this room have been doing this. There's about 11 states out west that have been exchanging UI data through their labor market information shops for many years, and they've built a data set as well, and they can look at mobility across the region and see where folks are going for jobs and think about retention in some of their states as well. And federal developments here, the 2016 budget has a couple of proposals that would start to allow performance outcomes to be looked at by doing federal data matching, so perhaps ease some of the burden on states to do this all themselves. One is there's support for draft legislation that expands access to the National Directory of New Hires. And there's also a proposal to overturn the ban in WIOA on having a federal WIOA database. Right now, you're not allowed to actually keep all of that data at the federal level, but having a federal longitudinal data system with a small cross set of that data might help for some of that performance reporting as well. So that's in there. And also the use of tax data from SSA. As we all know, there are some folks missing from UI data. SSA data is annual, so it serves a slightly different purpose, but it does cover all workers, including self-employed. So there's efforts to tap into SSA data for things like gainful employment, the gainful employment rule through Department of Education, as well as the college rating system. Let's talk about credentials for a few minutes. So there's a couple of state efforts to capture those non-degree credentials I mentioned. One is the CompTIA pilot. CompTIA is a trade association. Illinois is nodding, yes. CompTIA is a trade association that issues industry certifications for IT workers. In Illinois and California originally started getting the data from CompTIA and matching it with their post-secondary CTE data to actually be able to look at in their career and technical education programs, what % of students are taking exams, what % of students are passing exams. Then they link it to the UI data and can actually see the wage bump associated with earning that industry credential. So that's been expanding to several other states. The big thing that's helped that to expand is the fact that Department of Education has said that FERPA does not apply to third-party certification vendors, so they have more flexibility to share that data. In addition, the Workforce Credentials Coalition, I'm sure some of your states are involved in that. North Carolina and California are leading that effort. They're working on a pilot with the National Student Clearinghouse to get a couple of other big trade associations to share their certification data with the Student Clearinghouse so that they can build a nationwide platform for doing some of this data matching and being able to better record high priority industry certifications. And the National Governors Association right now is working on a Veterans Policy Academy and thinking about how to get veterans licenses and certifications. And so they're working with states, particularly on linking veterans data, but in general, getting better information about workers, licenses, and certifications in the state. Federal developments, WIOA is, again, going to drive a lot of the recognition that there's a need to get these data on these credentials. The recognized post-secondary credential definition in WIOA is very inclusive. It is not just degrees and certificates. It also specifically calls out licenses and industry-awarded certifications. So it's part of the performance measures. It's in the accountability system. We'd like to help figure out alternative ways other than having your case managers spend long hours trying to track down folks and get information from them about their credentials to get that information. There's also going to be some new questions on the current population survey. That is a big deal. We're going to get some better nationwide information about licenses and certification holding, and hopefully be able to get some a little bit better information about the value of those credentials. Let's see. Why don't we skip? Go to the next one. I want to leave time for the other panelists. So finally, just a couple other trends and resources I wanted to give a shout out to. The theme of this conference is right on, the need to demonstrate data impact. As we talk to the media, as we talk to legislators, it's increasingly, the questions are increasingly getting to, okay, we've had, federal grants out for a few years. We know that we have governance in our state. We know that these systems are being built. What's happening with them? What are we doing? So we're always trying to look for useful case studies and showing value, and I know Neil's going to talk about that a little bit too. But just to have sustainability of these systems, we're going to need to get really good at telling our story, and it also to kind of combat privacy concerns and make the value proposition, that yes, this data we hold it privacy and confidentiality as being very crucial and important, but also there's a trade-off, and the data has value, and it has value for parents and students and families. And I did want to mention the SWEEP project. So the SWEEP project, it's the State Workforce Education and Alignment Project, and that's out of National Skills Coalition, where where Workforce Data Quality Campaign is based as well. And they are specifically helping states create tools that can help their state legislators and other policymakers make decisions about workforce and education programs. So I've listed the website and would encourage you to take a look at that site. They have some really interesting information about dashboards, supply and demand reports, and career pathway evaluators. And finally, return on investment studies. Again, that's like the kind of what we see as being the next big thing. Virginia's smiling because Virginia's starting to do some ROI studies. Mississippi has started to do some comparison group studies on ROI. Washington has been doing them for years, and their legislators really rely on them. I'm sure I'm missing some that are doing it as well. But we think that's going to be a really key piece, especially for policymakers to find value in these systems. And another trend we're seeing is a lot more discussion, at least in DC circles, about engaging employers in discussing and recognizing the value of these data systems. Our partners at the Chamber of Commerce are working on a paper that's going to be released later this spring about how employers can use information they have and information in state longitudinal data systems to do some predictive analytics about their hiring and get smarter about how they're evaluating candidates, how they're looking beyond kind of the bachelor's degree to more granular skill information, and thinking about that in their hiring and retention and promotion decisions. And WDQC, we're going to be doing some research, especially looking into how businesses have played into the governance of some of these systems and really driven the policy agenda and the research questions in states. So if you have ideas about that, and if you've had some successful partnerships with employers and businesses in your states, please let my colleague Michelle Massey know. She's taking the lead on that paper and will do as great a job as she always does. So that is it for me, and I'm looking forward to taking questions and having more of a discussion, but thank you so much.